The electrification of transportation has really sped up in the last few years, in part because governments around the world are beginning to promote it as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's certainly true in Canada, where the federal government has recently announced $15 billion over 8 years to electrify buses and other forms of transit across the country. At the head of that subsector sits Dr. Josipa Petrunic, and we're going to talk to her about how she became head of CUTRIC and how she developed an interest in electric transportation from after growing up in Calgary, which is dominated by oil and gas, and how she got from there to here. So welcome to the interview, Josipa.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, tell me a little. I've interviewed you a lot, and many of our viewers will recognize the work that CUTRIC does around electrifying transit. But I'm really curious how you got interested in this, and tell us a little bit about your journey from Calgary to where you are now.
Oh, that is a long story, but let's see here. The Coles Notes version. I grew up in Alberta, and during that period as a high school student, I definitely knew I needed to leave. And there was a reason for that. I did all my university outside of Alberta. And it's because I knew at that time I wanted to dedicate my life to, if not environmental sciences, something that would change the planet. And there just weren't jobs in Alberta. That was the frank reality. I mean, everybody I graduated with was going into engineering, which is fine, but it was all oil and gas engineering. And, that was like 1990s, late 1990s, and I just didn't see a future there. And to be honest, a couple of my sisters also left for the exact same reason. So, I mean, Alberta was a great place to grow up, but there just were no other jobs. So fast forward, when I came back to Alberta years later to run for politics, where you and I first met, it was also a narrative about learning as to whether I could actually make an impact in diversifying the economy. And even then, in the 2010s, extremely difficult. I mean, the degrees I took were in science and technology studies. They were in a variety of fields that allowed me to deconstruct engineering and mathematics, especially, I mean, my PhD focused on the history of thermodynamics and engineering sciences and mathematical theorems around energy sciences. But if you wanted to do anything that wasn't just pulling oil out of the ground and then refining it and marketing it, you just couldn't find a job in Alberta. That was the truth of it. And so in terms of where I ended up, I mean, academically, I did a lot of stints at a lot of different universities, started up a couple companies, got bloodied by learning what not to do when you want to protect your own IP and learn those lessons the hard way. But at the end of the day, I ended up doing a postdoc at McMaster University in electric vehicle innovation, which was a very natural home for me. That was in the automotive sector, but it was clear to me that at that time in the early 2010s, it was under the government of Stephen Harper, and there was no appetite to invest in electric vehicle automotive technology. So I jumped ship when I heard that there was an opportunity to use some seed financing to start up a transit innovation consortium. I went after that. I pitched myself to some of the industry partners that were putting that money forward. And I pitched this plan for this big, bold vision across Canada. And thankfully, they invested in my belief. So that is how I ended up here.
Well, that big, bold vision really seems to be paying off because it appears that the federal government has bought into it as well. So you manage a consortium of, there's a wide range of members in CUTRIC, from manufacturers to transit authorities and other groups. Is it like herding cats?
Oh, yes. But also, to be honest, I mean, the cats are very well structured. So to give credit to the industry, there's a lot of innovative thinkers. Now, I have to say, disproportionately, a lot of the innovation has been led by women. And I say disproportionately in transit because over 90% of CEOs in transit are men. Over 60% of transit riders are women. So there's a mismatch between clientele and CEO directorship. And that is something we've been discussing and trying to change. But if you look at that, 10% of CEOs and transit directors who are women, every single one of them is leading a transit technology project around electrification or zero emissions in Canada. And British Columbia is a good example. Both TransLink and BC Transit are now led by women. Both of them are dedicated to full zero emissions within the near term and intermediate future. And that's the same story across Canada. So it is a little bit of herding cats, but we have some great innovative leaders that are willing to be herded, shall I say.
As the industry shifts from diesel over to electric, and different skill sets and experience will presumably be more valued. Is that an opportunity and are we likely to see more and more female, senior executives in the transit authorities and more CEOs?
Well, I think the fundamental issue is why aren't there more CEOs in general? I mean, when I was starting CUTRIC 5 years ago and still until right before the pandemic, it was very common for me to be the only woman in the meeting room. In particular, when you show up and you're talking to a lot of stakeholders, or if there were women in the meeting room, which was more and more frequent, they were junior. And why is that still the case? I mean, I'm 41. Why am I fighting my mother's feminist battles? 20 years later, it's not right, because we've been graduating women more than 50% from all disciplines for over 20 years. And the only disciplines that lag are physics and engineering. And even those, you're graduating women at the rate of 30% across many Canadian universities. But if you look at women CEOs, they're not 30%. And if you work at engineering firms, they're not 30% of the workforce either. So somewhere women are tapping out or they're being excluded. And therefore in transit, it's the same issue. Women are tapping out or they're excluded. And it fundamentally comes down to the fact they're having to earn an income and raise kids and take care of the household, and it's burnout. So I don't think transit is unique in that regard. But I would say that transit is possibly a very fertile ground for attracting excellent women into the industry, because it doesn't have the gendered history of the automotive sector. Automotive, I took a couple conferences in Detroit to know that automotive was not the place for me. That is a landscape that is still very masculine and very gendered in its orientation. And so transit is a little bit more open.
So I'm not sure if this is a fair question for you, Josipa, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you can tell me what you think. But I'm curious about what women would bring to those senior roles that would be an added value that you would get, or the organization would get, the industry would get, as opposed to men.
Yeah, and actually I'm asked that question all the time. Well, yeah, it's not right and it's sexist that there aren't women, but would women really do things differently, right? That's the fundamental question. And we always use that language of, yeah, we bring different perspectives. And it is true, men, and in particular white men, are important at the decision-making table, but they're not the only ones with ideas. So it's like a monocrop that is subject to pesticides, right, or pests, and therefore cannot protect itself. If you have only one kind of thinking at the table, you're certainly only going to have one kind of problem creation and one kind of solution set. And so women have different experiences, and let's pull out a couple that are very obvious, right? There's thousands that I could talk about, but I'll pull a couple. Have you ever, as a man, menstruated on rail? No, you haven't, right? You have never, as a male CEO of transit, ever had the problem of trying to find where are their menstrual products at an emergency washroom when you're stuck on a subway. And you're on your way to work and you're about to have a menstrual flow and it's about to go right through your suit and you're about to have to show up to work drenched in blood. That is a common experience for women, common. And that's just so basic and fundamental. Any woman you look at right now, 25% chance she is menstruating right now. So where are all the tampons and the maxi pads and the clean washrooms and the apps on my phone that tell me where the clean washrooms are on my transit network? That is such a simple, basic thing that if we had more women in positions of power in transit, we would have had that decades ago. That's one example. Now add to it all the examples of all the subway stations, the streetcar stations, the bus stop stations that are improperly lighted, right? They're improperly lit rather, or they're not connected enough so that you can actually track where you are and share that with somebody, your loved one, who may be tracing how you're getting home. Or they have only stairs or really difficult doorways. Oh, but you have a baby carriage and you have shopping bags and you're wearing high heels and you're carrying a suitcase or a briefcase. It's not designed for women. And if we had more women in positions of power, we would think about those design elements. That's just two examples, the design of our system and where are the menstrual apps and products and services, two basic systems, but there are loads of other examples we can say that women immediately bring to the table.
Last question. And so that's an example where industry dominated by men haven't taken into account the needs of women. What is it? I've heard it said that women bring a different management style, a different way of communicating that is beneficial to an organization. In your experience, is that the case?
You know, I'm not men are from Mars and women are from Venus ontological type, where I think we have fundamental and natural differences. I mean, there is a school of thought that says there are fundamental differences in the way in which we manage. I'm more of the sociological mindset that there may be different ways in which we manage, and very likely there are, but they're not natural and innate. We weren't born with them. They're things we learn to manage because that's the only way we can navigate to the top. And I've often reverted to the fact that I do think on average, you will find that women tend to have more of a collaborative framework, more of a team-based framework, more of a family-based network, and less of a need to demean and degrade, but that is not necessarily the case. And I use myself as a case in point, so I never like to kind of sociologically say, put women in power and you won't have any dictatorial monsters. Of course you will, because power corrupts everybody. But the idea is that we have more diverse problem sets and diverse solution sets that make our systems better. We then create all the solutions that keep the dictators out, right? Whether they're women or men. I do think if you look at how women are raised, you know, from an early age, we have to menstruate and deal with that whole system. So we're systems thinkers from beginning. Then we have to deal with navigating our way through a world, myself included, where sexual assault, sexual innuendo, microaggressions of sexual nature are constantly part of your professional life. And it's only in the last 5 years where we've all felt comfortable saying, hey, whoa, that's not only wrong, but you know, I'm going to take it to court. That's only the last few years. So we've all had to navigate that stuff. And it is a fine balance of networking and collaborative style to be able to move ahead and not let those kinds of things hurt your career. So I would say maybe, Markham, that if women are more collaborative and have more team-based management style, it's not because we were born that way, it's because we were forced to be that way to get ahead.
Josipa, thank you very much. Insightful as always.
Thank you so much.